started working in the mills, there were almost no colored in the mill. Could you talk about that and how it's changed?
Well, no, there wasn't. The only color that worked in the mill, the blacks, they had more or less, you clean out the restrooms, and they did manual jobs of that sort. And they worked out where in the yard to keep the yards clean, and they worked in cotton where they'd open up the bales of cotton and have the go haul cotton in and out, the bales of cotton. And most of the time back then they didn't have the machinery they got today to haul. They had old hand trucks, you know, and they would roll it in and out after that, and they were used for that kind. And then another thing also, they could not use the white people's facilities in the restrooms. They could not use that. And then, in fact, the water fountains was the same way. They had one that they're supposed to use, and the whites had one they're supposed to use. And that seems kind of bad, but that's the way it was, and people just accepted it as that. But I'm glad now that it's really not like that, because so I got some good black friends today, fine friends, and I never did see where it was wrong for them to come up and take a drink of water while I was taking a drink of water. I used the same restroom I used, but you know, I'm talking about in the men or the women, but it just did not happen back in those days.
You were in the mill when the change came about, and you were a supervisor then. Tell us about how people adjusted to it.
Well, now, I wasn't a supervisor till about in the 40s. And, well, there's a big changes coming along at that time, too. And people resented, as you mentioned a while ago in this plant you were talking about, how the modern machinery was coming out. Well, they say, well, that's taking our jobs. And to a certain extent it was. But all at the same time, I believe, and always have believed, that if you making things easier for one thing, you got to have somebody to make that machinery that's making that easy. So you're just swapping jobs, so to speak. But a lot of times it put pressure, especially on the older fellas at that time, where it made it hard, because they couldn't find a job because they didn't have any other skills maybe. And it's still the same way today. You read where there's a mill, what was it, closed around here just a while back. And I read an article in the paper about this lady saying that's all she knew. That's all I know is working in this mill. And I can sympathize with her, because I know what she's going through, and it's hard after you get, say, she's 50-something years old. And people may tell you, and it is a law, that they can't discriminate against you on account of your age or your color or religion or whatever it may be. But to a certain extent, it's still so, whether we want to believe it or not, because I know for a fact, as being a supervisor, that whenever you come across one, you know, your company won't, well, we can't, they won't complain out and tell you, we can't hire too many that's too old. Our insurance go up, you know that. The average age of what you got in your plant, and if you got too many in there that's got a lot of age on them, well, your insurance is going to be higher. And well, all they got to say when you turn in a form application for a job, you look it over, if you got too much age, you say, well, you don't tell anybody that. But I never, we were lucky to get who we could get when I was coming along, because you couldn't get enough to work. Well, but at times, at one time, it did get to where it was, you had a surplus of help. But you could pick that way if you wanted to. If you really desired to, you could say, you wouldn't say that, but say, well, I don't believe we need anybody in that kind of a job right now, or either maybe you're not qualified for that job, and maybe they were. And you can get around a lot of that today with that, and I feel sure that it's probably going on today. I don't know.
Now, this may not be part of your story, but I know that we were over at Columbus. They were talking about the factories, the plants preferring people who came straight from the country as against people who had spent time in the town. Was there anything like that you know?
To a certain extent, yes, sir.
Tell us about that.
Well, you see, you could get somebody that had never been inside of a plant in a cotton mill, and you bring him in. Well, you teach him the way that plant wanted him taught, just in that certain job that he was supposed to have and to do. Well, you put him with somebody on that job, and you check on him, see if you're teaching him in the right way, and ask a fella questions too. Well, he didn't know no other way. But on the other hand, you get somebody who had been in it and they had a little knowledge of that job. And maybe it did different, a little bit different at this plant than it was at the other. Well, it's harder to get them to go by your rules. They want to go by the old way, the way they were taught. So that, I think that has a lot to do with it right there.
Now, one of the things that interests me is that even when you started in the mills, I believe there were mostly women. And yet we see so few pictures of women to that time. We see so few leaders, you know, from out in the Union from the women and so forth. Could you talk about the role of women there?
Well, I hadn't thought about that too much, but since you mentioned it, there were a lot of women that worked in the plants, and especially, as I said, I worked in the weaving department, and there had a lot of weavers. In fact, seemed like the women were a little bit more apt with their hands and could tie knots, you know, on the weaver's knot. You had to tie a certain knot. Well, they could use their hands a whole lot better than most men, but now there's a lot of men too, but there's a lot of women that did mostly weaving, and good weavers too. And I think that had a lot to do with it. I can't understand why. I hadn't given that much thought. I'm gonna be honest with you. I really hadn't. But there were a lot of women in there. But you know, back in those days, man was the one that took the lead. It didn't make no difference what, you know. Then they give him the credit. I reckon it comes back to that. I don't know.
How about, do you remember when the women started to have the right to vote? Did your wife vote, and did your sisters vote? I'm just curious about that.
Well, now, yes. Now, my wife, she would vote. And in fact, but there's some of them said they didn't want to vote. You know, it worked both ways, but the reason why my wife, she was, when my kids were coming along, small boys, she is active in, well, we call it PTA, I don't know what they call it now. But anyway, she played a big role in that and was president in it and all that. Well, in fact, I blame her a lot of times for the tax that we got here, because she went on the radio with it at that time about that. Now, she took an active role in that thing when there wasn't no sales tax in South Carolina. We need sales tax for our children, which there's nothing wrong with that. 3 cents if I remember correctly. Okay, they got the 3 cents. What is it now? 5. And it was supposed to go for schools. But now the women took an active part, and you can see how they can affect things too when they do take a part.
Hey, you mentioned listening to FDR on the radio. Just try to think back and describe, as though I wasn't even there, what it was like, where you were when you heard him, and what he said, and all of that.
Man, I was sitting right there at home, a young fella. And in later years too, you know, he was on up even after I married. When if you found out he was coming on to make a speech.
Start over and talk about Roosevelt, and you want to use the word Roosevelt.
Okay. Okay. Well, President Roosevelt, whenever he was come on to make a speech, well, we sit around the house and listened, turned that radio and waited for him to come on, because to me he was a great speaker, one of the best to me. And he did things for us, and as we sit and listen to him, that I think it was a very appropriate thing at that particular time, what our country needed. And all the people that I knew, my friends especially, they were right in for it. If you said something about Roosevelt, you was in bad. I mean, you was usually in trouble. And I had to go along with that theory too, because I thought he was a great man, because he did things that brought this country out in that Great Depression that we had. And when he put the CCC boys, he's 16 years old, if you go in, he gives you, and then finally got around to the WPA and all these, and the NRA and all these things. A lot of them, they said it was unconstitutional, but anyway, he did it. But we loved him, and his speeches, when he come in, he'd tell about all these different things, what this going to do, and we all took a great interest in it. I thoroughly enjoyed his speeches, but I'd sit and listen to that. But I don't take too much time today with it when you can see him on TV, but maybe I ought to. I do listen some now. I think we've got a good president now.
When did you get your first radio? We got our first radio.
Well, now I'm gonna have to stop and think about that a little bit now. That was, I believe I was about 12, 14 years old before we got our first, back in the 20s, late 20s too, before we ever got one.
Sorry, start again and mention radio.
Well, our first radio, had to be back in the late 20s before we ever had one. And I can remember this after they got to be so popular though. You take the Grand Ole Opry, we lived on these mill villages. And the radios, everybody had one when it finally got to where you could have one. But you could walk down one of the streets and they'd listen to the Grand Ole Opry on TV on a Saturday night, you would never miss a beat. Everybody have it on wide open. I remember that well. You could leave home and everybody listened to the Grand Ole Opry, and most mill people enjoyed that. And that's about the first time I remember about radio our first radio was back in the late 20s, about maybe 29, somewhere 28 or 29, somewhere along in there.
What about live music in the mill village?
Oh, well, about the only live music we had outside of radio there's always a group of men in the village that could play instruments, and those would get together, say on a weekend. And if they didn't have a house, I meant a dance hall or somewhere, some of the people in the village would say, "Hey, come on over to my house." They'd roll up the rug, clean out that room. You'd have a square dance, and that's the way we got most of our music. Is that, and you'd practice with those guys. I never could play a guitar too good, but I tried. I played the banjo a little bit with them. But and then you'd go out to these dances, and especially back, and remember this, you brought that up about music. Made me think of one funny thing. We went to a place one night and to play for them, and I couldn't play too good, no way, but they had two good fiddle players and had a couple of guitar players, and different instruments them fellas had, and I had that old banjo. We was playing away there. And, well, they're dancing away, and we went back in, you'd pass the hat, see if you could get him. We went ahead and had that dance and playing that music, and we passed the hat. It's about 1932, I believe it was. Right in the heart of that depression. You got one dime. No, Louis Long, he was playing the fiddle. He said, looked over at me and he looked at the other fellas and he says, "Here, we'll make them pay for that." He started off, the regular way, and I believe he played Waiting for the Robert E. Lee, and he started off with the regular way, and he got faster and faster and faster and faster, and had those people and they got "Hey, slow it down, slow it down, slow it down." And he didn't die laughing. We just kept right on, But that's the way you had your fun. You made most of it yourself, and the music was the same way.
What about moonshine in the village?
Oh, you could always find that. Well, mostly back then, there wasn't any liquor stores. It just had to be corn liquor, bootleg liquor. Well, there's a lot of it went on in the villages at that time. Some of them would sell it to make them a little extra money, you know. But the biggest thing was what we call homebrew. It was beer, but you know, it was just that. Now, there's a lot of that. Most of the families make them some homebrew, but not all now. I'm going to say there's a lot of them that would make that. But if they found out you was making it and selling it, well, they could have you up and have you in court about it. But now they had a lot of people had that as homebrew.
Did the people running the village, the manufacturer, did they care about it, all that kind of thing?
Well, usually, now they'd leave you alone, especially the ones I was working at. But now I've heard at one particular plant here in town at that time, this man that run it, he was very, very strict. In fact, we used to laugh at some of the guys that worked down there and tell them, you know, that you got to do what, I'm not going to call the man's name, tell you what he said do, because if you don't, you'd lose your job, and a lot of them would. But if you didn't do exactly like he said do, they tell me that, now it's just hearsay, but I come pretty straight, that if anybody come to your house, some of your people, and wanted to stay a while, if they stayed too long, they'd come and tell you got to get them out of there. They can't stay. You know, now to me, now I've never had that to happen in my lifetime, in all these plants that I worked in. I worked at different ones, but I never heard tell that. But they told me that happened there. He didn't want other people coming in and staying in the company house, and I couldn't understand why in the world that man could tell you to get people out of your house when you was paying him. Well, the rent was very reasonable, but at least you was paying rent on that house. That's your house while you was renting it from him. But they say that happened. Now, I wasn't there, but I got reason to believe, and I'd heard it many times that people that worked there said that.
Now talk about the quality of housing you got.
Well, tell you the honest truth, some of those houses are still standing today. But now they've been improved some on. You didn't have underpinning on your houses. In fact, when I was a little old boy, houses pretty high off of the ground, you played under them, you know, on a rainy day, and when it wasn't too cold. But usually they're just regular houses, but the biggest problem is maybe in the wintertime where you'd have to try to keep warm, because most of the houses had high ceilings, and they didn't have window fans and things and air conditioning like you got today. And you'd freeze a lot of times at night. You'd take maybe sometimes you'd go into your room. I never did do that, but I've heard tell of a lot of people. Well, I believe my sister did. It'd warm by the fire, warm some bricks and things, and wrap them up in a towel or something, and put them at their feet, you know, and things of that sort. But
what I'd like to have you do is to compare the mill housing with the kinds of housing that the same kind of class of people had around the mill village. Could you do that?
Well, the houses that we lived in, they, as I said, they had big windows, and they had high ceilings, and they had, well, like most of the houses, but they wasn't as well equipped, you know, as the houses that wasn't on the mill village. Now, some mill villages kept the houses up, and they looked great, and they're just as comfortable as any of them in town. They really was. They maybe not been as pretty a house or anything, because a lot of them made on the same style, you know, as you go down, the same way, but all at the same time, most of those houses, they were comfortable, and I didn't have them where they had, now there's wood floors, and they didn't have where you could see down through the floor and things of that sort. They usually had, every mill would have usually a carpenter, they called it, and so whenever you would have a problem at your house, you'd report it to the company, and they'd come down and they would if it was legitimate, well, needed to be done, well, they tried to do it. They tried to keep them up. I'll have to say that. On the ones that I lived on, they really did. And some of the houses today's got better lumber in it than the one I got right there right now.
I wanted to get that feeling about the mills really looked after the place. Yeah.
Yeah,
good.
they did.
Yeah.
They did. That is, most of them did. In
Yeah.
fact, the one that I worked at, and I was telling you about where they had one on that strike, they're the first ones that I know of. It had indoor plumbing. We had it in the houses then, and most people plants didn't. They had outhouses, and they had them up to in the 30s, way up in the 30s, before they ever changed them around. But even back then, we had them. And see, that's what I tell you. I was fortunate to be where I was at that time, because we had water in the house, everything. You didn't. Now, when I was a boy, where we lived, we didn't. They had what we call a spigot up in the middle of the street, just like this street here. You'd put one out there in the middle of the street. Well, everybody on that street went there to get water. You had to carry it. And but you can see how we've come a long way in that. Now, that was a difference in the houses. It come back in the houses of that. Now, I imagine most of the houses around, maybe up in town and all, would have that in it.
Jamie, how would a pan off of this be?
You mean pan across?
Yes. Could you get a feeling of the neighborhood from here? Just look at it and see. Okay? All right, good. Okay. I think we
if you could talk to me
All right.
and move around a little bit because you're going to be doing that.
I'm gonna move this wide way into. Will it matter where it's at?
I'm going to get it so it's behind you.
Oh, behind me. Okay.
We
Okay.
won't see your feet,
Okay.
but we would see you down about here. So that's why we wanted to
Do this for me. Sounds okay.
just a still of the family picture.
I guess
See if
it's
we
all
can get
right.
a little more
Sometimes we get
contrast.
the noise of the cloth, you know.
Yeah, that's right. A rattle, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
These fellas think of everything, Polly. Who would have thought? It's enough for Polly and my wife, myself. She's sickly and not able to get about. Now, she used to be a little old skinny thing, and
Well, you don't have one of those.
and I tell you, when she had that operation, that's when that started. Something happened to her pituitary gland.
Yeah, that's nice, Jamie. Yeah, that's good. Been into the grandfather, yeah.
He was a fine old gentleman. She was a lovely lady.
What are you talking about?
Your mom?
Oh,
You see, we've got.
Oh,
that
she's-
picture
she-
goes
oh.
up on the-
That's what I'm talking. Why did you think I talked?
I didn't know who. I said I wondered who you was talking about.
Okay, sound is ready.
All right, I'm going to just tell me who the woman is on the picture up there, and then the man.
This is my mother, and this is my dad.
Did they work in the mills?
Yes, sir, they certainly did. They worked in the mill. And these are my brothers and sisters.
Could you do that again and say, both my parents worked in the mill. This
Okay.
is my father. This is my mother.
Okay.
Just a moment. You ready? All right. Fine.
Both my parents worked in the mills, and this is my mother and father and brother and sister that you see here. And I imagine that picture was taken, I'm just a guess at it, but I would say around 1910 or 1912.
Could
somewhere.
you do that once again and point them out?
Okay. Wait a minute now, how'd you tell me to say that before?
But when you go.
This is my mother and father, and they both worked in the mills. And these are my brothers and sisters. And they worked in the mills back in those days. And when I come along, well, I went into the mill also. And these books that we have right here, a friend of mine is an old gentleman, and I always thought a lot of him, a fine man. And he gave me these books, and he told me, he says, now I know things are different today, even when he gave me these books, than they are today when he give them to me. He says, but the fundamentals is all still the same. And I'll never forget the gentleman for what he did to me. And his name, he's a great big man, and he had great big bushy hair. And when he talked, and he was